Welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly. Supporting good housing for all is a key part of our work in our programme on future cities and in our work on council housing. We were horrified by the Grenfell fire on 14th of June 2017, when 72 people died. Many families were destroyed and hundreds were made homeless. What have we learned since then has been almost impossible to believe and comprehend. We've learned much of this thanks to the research and reporting of Peter Apps, who is with us today. Peter is the Deputy Editor of Inside Housing. He has reported on the fire from the very start and has worked closely with the Grenfell community. He's the author of the new book, Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen. Joan Smith, who has written for us on the importance of council housing for her and her family, said in the literary review that Peter Apps provides a remarkable book, a damning verdict, but justifiably so. This is simply one of the most horrifying books I've ever read. Peter is joined by Paul Smith. Paul is Chief Executive of Elim Housing. He has worked in housing for over 30 years at a senior level, and prior to joining Elim, was the Cabinet Member for Housing in Bristol City Council. Thank you, Paul and Peter, for joining us. Peter, you call this the most serious crime committed on British soil this century.
Yeah, I do. I think, how do you measure the severity of a crime? In terms of the number of people who died, you could take all of the terror attacks on London in since the 2000s and add them together, and you would have had more deaths at Grenfell Tower. The financial consequences of it have been vast. The government spent £9 billion removing cladding and insulation from other buildings already, and the sort of the ripple effect throughout the market of people who've been impacted by this is huge. It's hundreds of thousands of people have either kind of had to delay selling their property or had to pay out money and waking watches, all that kind of thing, and a lot of it comes back to the fallout from this fire, really. And so I think it's almost unquantifiable. But even before you get into all of that, you can just straightforwardly say that there were 72 people, 18 children who aren't here anymore, and I think that alone makes it the most serious crime that's happened in Britain this century.
One of the most important things about the book to me is the way you centre the people involved, particularly the victims, the ones who died, the ones who managed to escape. And I thought that was a critical part of the book, but it couldn't have been a very easy book to write and indeed research.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. A lot the sort of information in, so the book is, as you suggest there, it's split, so you sort of one chapter on a kind of minute by minute journey through the night, and then one chapter on the background of how and why the fire happened, and we sort of follow particular characters through the night, and yes, it's a lot of that information, some of that information came from interviews with people I did, and or with relatives of people I did. Some of it came from the sort of public record that's been put together by the inquiry, but I think what's really important is that everyone who kind of looks at Grenfell, and hopefully people who read the book, come away with a sense that these were human beings. We're sort of assaulted by bad news, and the number 72 dead doesn't really mean anything to us in this day and age. And that's, you can't feel the humanity of every tragedy you read about. It wouldn't be possible to exist if you did. But I think I wanted to get across to anyone, if you're going to read about Grenfell and think about Grenfell and understand Grenfell, these were human beings, and what happened to them was real human suffering. And so that's why it was kind of always so important to me that if this book was going to be written, it would need to have the human beings and the residents of the tower at its heart.
Paul, what were your immediate reactions when you heard about Grenfell and your views about the enormity of the crime that Grenfell is?
I think the first thing is you see the pictures. I remember waking up in the morning and seeing the pictures on firstly on Twitter, I think, then on TV, and it was sort of horrifying, a bit like 9/11 in a way, of seeing a sort of block of flats going up like that, and thinking about what had happened to people in that circumstance. Absolutely horrifying. And then the second thought was, could this happen in any of our blocks? At the time, I was cabinet member for housing in Bristol, 59 high-rise blocks, and a real concern that, you know, if it could happen in this block in Grenfell, could it happen in any of our blocks in Bristol? So it was, yeah, it was horrifying in terms of itself, but also potentially the implications of it more widely.
And Peter's centering of the residents, I thought, when I was reading your most recent work with the Housing Association, you centre residents, don't you, in your work? These are the very heart of why you're in housing.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't talk too much about it because of a potential legal case, but we've got a small block of flats which has got an issue with the cladding and the fire breaks and the roof and pretty much everything else, which to put right will cost us more than the cost of building the building. And I've made it, you know, personally an important point that I went and spoke to every one of the residents in that flat and in those flats. And what you find is the sort of vibrant, very diverse community that you find in the Grenfell Tower sort of exists also in the block that we've got. And for me, it was so critically important that, you know, I didn't delegate that. I went and talked to the residents about the risk that we'd identified and also what we were going to do to put it right. And, you know, at the end of the day, is people should feel safe and comfortable in their own homes. They shouldn't be there, you know, hoping that one of their neighbours doesn't accidentally start a fire which could kill them and their children. And, you know, Peter's book brings that, you know, very much to the fore, rightly, I think.
Peter, I mean, that's an example of, you know, there's been warnings now. Grenfell was not just a tragedy, but also a warning to others. And Paul there is acting on that. But we're not very good at this, are we? You talk in the book about a previous fire at Lakenhall House in Southwark, when cladding caught fire and there 6 people were killed. And there are other fires in tower blocks, haven't there been, which should have acted as a warning as well?
Yeah, there's a long antecedents to the Grenfell Tower fire, and I think you know, we might discuss the title of the book as we go on, but half of the title is how we let Grenfell happen, and I think that is how I see it. I think that there was the information needed to prevent the Grenfell Tower fire, in terms of the dangers of combustible cladding and the problems with compartmentation and the potential dangers of the stay put policy if everything went wrong, were all known years before Grenfell Tower caught fire, and they just weren't taken seriously enough by either the industry or government. And so, yes, there's a long line of fires. I think Lakenhall stands out because it killed 6 people, and lots of these fires are there's only sort of one death, or that no one dies, but Lakenhall was different, and 3 of them children. And it also stands out because it led to a very long, and in its time sort of forgotten by many, but in its time quite high profile coroner's inquest, which made suggestions to government, to the social housing sector, to the fire brigade about what needed to be done to prevent a repeat. And unfortunately, very few of those recommendations were acted upon. So it's kind of the ultimate miswarning, really. Now,
we've had the first stage of the inquiry, and we've got the second stage we'll be reporting next year. It's trying to look at the lessons to learn, who to blame. But one of the problems with this is there are myriad people involved who had some responsibility at different levels. You call this a dishonest world, Peter, the many people responsible. But we'll come on to policy changes later. But what makes up this dishonest world for you?
Well, I suppose. Do you mean sort of the individual organisations you want me to talk about? Or, okay, fine. So it starts from the top with government, really. I think that the government, through the actions of various ministers and officials down the years, when not only did it fail to deal with the warnings, it also kind of failed to be open about the extent to which it was failing to deal with the warnings, if that makes sense. So it wasn't only that the government was not acting on good information, it was presenting a front that it had. And I think then if you look at some of the corporate organizations involved, you see, particularly from the manufacturers of the cladding and the insulation which was used on Grenfell Tower, a long history of fire tests which showed that these materials were dangerous. I think it was from as early as 2004, the cladding manufacturer Arconic tested its product and discovered that when it was bent into a particular shape, it burnt with this incredible ferocity, but decided to leave that product on the market to continue to allow it to be sold and allow it to be fitted to the walls of people's homes, because there would be a consequence for its profit margin if it didn't become less competitive. It would be required to sort of change its investment into other less fire risky products. And so we, at many levels, we elected not to do the things that were necessary in order to prevent a serious cladding fire happening.
We'll come on to some of the individual areas of responsibility in a moment, but Paul, you've talked before, I know, about responding to this idea of the bonfire of red tape, which is a term used and a very unfortunate one, and the way that this has reduced health and safety and so on, particularly in areas of housing, but also other areas. What's your view on this now?
Well, firstly, on the previous question, to say, if you read Peter's book, and also, I mean, I'm somebody who's been following his sort of almost daily reports from the inquiry itself over a couple of years, and fantastic that Inside Housing made that time available for that coverage, really, because it's so important. Is that if you read it, you can see that there were many opportunities that this could have been stopped from happening. There were many times when different actors could have intervened in a way that this cladding would never have been put on this building, and in every case they failed. So in one way you could say it's a system failure, which of course it is, but also it's a personal failure of all of those people. I don't think it's like, can we put them in a rank order who's the most culpable? They're all culpable. Anybody who could have stopped this happening is, in my view, is to blame. But I think that there is a system issue. I think it goes back actually into the 80s. It's not just the bonfire red tape of Eric Pickles. It goes back, for instance, to the deregulation, effectively, of building regulation, of allowing private companies to actually take that work on. You can actually see websites where a company, I think a lot of them have toned it down now, where they're basically saying, employ us to do your building regulation and we'll make sure you get through. And whereas councils still do have building regulation officers, of course, there's better money in the private sector. You find that the councils become denuded of the level of expertise that they've got, so that you end up with a reduced level of quality of building regulation from councils, and in some respects some dubious building regulation from organisations. Once you move to effectively a system of self-regulation, then you're almost asking for things to go wrong. And I don't think there can be any doubt that this continual obsession with reducing regulations, health and safety gone mad, and all those sorts of attitudes where what you want to do is be driven by companies' sense of good value, maybe British values or whatever. You see where that leads you. It leads you to Grenfell and these sorts of problems. because self-regulation doesn't work. We saw it in the finance sector in the 2008, 2009 crash. You have to hold regulation of all sectors in the centre. In housing associations, we had the removal of consumer regulation from the sector, and we've seen that in itself has also led to problems, with the focus being on financial viability of organisations rather than on customer service.
I mean, I don't think, Peter, you disagree with any of that. I think you write a lot about the attack on red tape and health and safety and so on in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with. I think that was a pretty thorough summary there from Paul. Really, I mean, yeah, we have. There has been and the Grenfell inquiry evidence charts this. Really, there's almost fetishization, really, of the idea that government should cut back the rules and regulations, get out of the way, and let industry take the lead, dating back certainly to the 1980s. And that's cut across so many areas, as Paul described. I mean, you know, the Grenfell Tower, when it was built under a different system of building regulations in called the London Model Bylaws in I think 1974, and those prohibited the use of combustible materials on the facade of a building. You know, and those would derive themselves from regulations which went all the way back to the Great Fire of London. So we took the decision to take those limits and restrictions away, and I think that there was a document which came out towards the end of the inquiry which said we'll probably see the consequences of this in around 30 years. So in some ways, Grenfell came along right on time.
Just before we move on to some other areas, you also write in the book, Peter, about, you know, shoddy workmanship. You had, you know, problems with fire detection systems, elevators, and so on.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of that mattered a great deal in a kind of causative sense, and some didn't. So, for example, the area where there's an enormous causative factor is the self-closing devices on flat entrance doors, and it appears to be evidence of both poor workmanship and then poor maintenance. The poor maintenance being very crucial there, because there was some very specific warnings about those, the need to replace those devices. But throughout this story, that sort of carelessness comes up. I mean, the fire cavity barriers in the cladding system, for example, were sort of, they were fitted. You sort of had vertical barriers fitted horizontally, or they're backwards, upside down, back to front, or missing completely. Those things didn't really matter in the fire, because the cladding was so combustible that you could fit a cavity barrier pretty perfectly and it's still going to burn around it. But they show, I think, if you have that kind of lack of care and you have those kind of that sense that these things don't matter, we'll just do what we can get away with, you will end up in a position sooner or later where something that does matter doesn't get done. So in a sense, all of it matters, even the stuff that didn't cause the deaths, because it shows an attitude that's consistent, and that attitude is one of callousness and not caring, really.
And just staying with you, Peter, just the inquiry, you had one main government department involved on regulations and safety and fire in housing, the Department for Communities and Local Government. You had two ministers giving evidence there. What do you think we learned from those pieces of evidence from Eric Pickles and from Stephen Williams, who at the time was a Bristol MP?
I think just to make sure that their names don't get missed off the list, we also had a guy called James Wharton. Brandon Lewis gave evidence from the Home Office, and I think he remains in Cabinet now. And Gavin Barwell, who went on to be Chief of Staff to Theresa May, all of them were called to give evidence, as well as those two. Stephen Williams, he was... So he was a relatively junior minister in the department at the time. It's sort of the coalition era when Liberal Democrats were sort of handed these, unless they were called Vince Cable or Nick Clegg, they were handed these kind of relatively minor government roles. But his brief included building regulations. So it's very relevant to what happened at Grenfell Tower. And he came in the period I mentioned a couple of questions ago. There was this inquest into the deaths at Lakanal House, which had made recommendations to government. And one of those really pivotal recommendations was that they review the building regulations guidance with particular regard to the issue of external fire spread. So the government was supposed to do that because there'd been a fire where there'd been really serious external fire spread, which had killed people. And it never did. That review never began. By the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, it was not only completed, it barely even started. It was 4 years after the inquest. And so Stephen Williams was one of the ministers who kind of held that baton. And what was happening at the same time was there was a group within Parliament, an all-party parliamentary group chaired by the late David Amess MP, who was very aware of what had happened at Lakanal House and why, and wanted government to speed this review up so that a second disaster didn't happen. And they sent some very strongly worded letters to all of the people who held that brief, including Stephen, and they received quite a sharp brush off, really. I can't remember the exact quote, but a letter bearing Stephen Williams' signature said something like, "I've seen nothing which convinces me this issue is urgent enough to disturb the work of my department by bringing it forward." And I mean, that's quite an extraordinary statement to make, given that you already had 6 deaths, 3 of them children, which, you know, what more urgent evidence should you need? So he was challenged about that at the inquiry. And I think there was a couple of things that struck me from his evidence. One was he really handed that responsibility off to the officials. I think what he told the inquiry is he didn't even read the letters on which his signature appeared. And I think that's surprising, really. I think this was an issue of life safety. It's an issue of building regulations, fire safety. People have actually died. Why not some more curiosity? Why was this so low down the priority list that he felt that it was okay not even to read the letters? And he said that he never read the Lakanal House coroner's inquest report at all. Bearing in mind he took office in 2014, which is only a year or so after it was published. Again, I found that quite surprising. And then I think towards the end, he also came across as a little unprepared, I think, it has to be said. I mean, there's this government standard that's very, very crucial to this story called Class 0, Class 0. I won't get too into the sort of technicalities of that now, but it was very much at the heart of the government evidence. And under cross-examination, Stephen Williams said that the first time he'd heard of that was the day he gave evidence. So he clearly wasn't too keen on following every twist and turn. And then in his final statement, I think he got the date for the Grenfell Tower fire wrong. So all in all, it was I think it was an eye-opening performance from him that we saw, because he really did seem to feel like he had no responsibility for what was happening in his brief under his watch, and really he was just there signing letters from officials and taking instruction from more senior ministers. And I think if you've even got everyone in this chain was kind of either passing responsibility up or down, everyone from the kind of ground level housing manager to the sort of senior executive at companies was sort of saying someone else somewhere else in the chain was responsible and I wasn't. But to have reached the kind of higher echelons of government, which even though he was a junior minister, that's where he was. It was central government. He was the guy who was in charge. And so to still see him sort of handing responsibility off, I think was quite telling about how the inquiry played out and how a lot of witnesses approached it.
And Paul, what were your reactions to listening to bits of the inquiries that came over the news and so on, and reading Peter's work?
Yeah, well, actually, not a huge amount of coverage in the news. I mean, I think I, like lots of other people in the housing sector, were very lucky, you know, to be getting Peter's updates. I mean, the whole thing was horrifying. As I said before, there were so many times when this could have been stopped from happening. Whether that was, you know, government in terms of politicians or civil servants, or whether it was businesses. And this goes back a long way. It's not, it doesn't just relate to the Conservative government. I mean, the Labour government previously didn't put right the building regulations system, and some of the fires that and some of the tests that Peter talks about happened well before the coalition government came in. I think probably it's the greatest argument for a circular firing squad I've ever read, really. And everybody trying to blame everybody else, was both disingenuous, but also completely unconvincing. And I think Peter sort of takes that apart really, really well. Obviously, the issue that hit us in Bristol was then firstly to check, once the cladding had been identified, which quite early on after the fire, the cladding was identified, was, have we got any of that cladding in Bristol? Which thankfully we didn't. Then to look at history of tower block fires in Bristol. I think the thing is you will always get fires in residential property. You can't plan on the basis that it might not happen. The classic of somebody falling asleep with a cigarette through to faulty equipment, which I think was the case that was at Grenfell with a fridge, through to all sorts of other reasons, and really worrying now about people using candles because they are trying to save their energy bills. There's like 1,001 ways that a fire can start. People having indoor barbecues has started a fire in Somerset a few years ago in a house. You have to plan on the basis that there will be fires, and there will be fires in blocks of flats which will be below other flats, and therefore the buildings have to be able to deal with that, and also the fire services have to be able to deal with that. And I think what we got at Grenfell was a case that there was a complete sort of system failure once the fire started. But as I say, it was a real issue for us at Bristol to look at and say, is this something that could be replicated here? And immediately after, we did events at all of our high-rise blocks. Not that it's just a high-rise issue. This can happen in a house or in a low-rise block. To make ourselves available to tenants to talk about their buildings and the fire safety measures in them with the fire service. And of course, I get, in some respects, the most controversial thing was the stay in put policy, which we were all expected to stand behind, which now it seems to slowly, quietly been dropped, and in favour of evacuation plans, and also what works needed to be done. I mean, there's been quite a lot of shocking reports, but there was an investigation done by housing associations in the southwest into houses built since 2005, looking at the fire breaks, and nearly 2/3 of properties that there was at least one failure with fire breaks being badly fitted or missing, and a real concern that it's left to the apprentice on the last day that it can possibly done to stick in a fire break with nobody really testing it's in the right place. And the problem with a lot of these measures is that once a building's finished, they're hidden. And the only way you can find out whether or not things are as they should be is to start taking the building apart, or taking parts of the building apart, to look into it. And I think we've been left with, obviously, Grenfell, terrible tragedy for the people directly involved and their families. And I'm sure that even amongst the people who survived, there's quite a lot of people suffering from mental anguish and PTSD and everything else, that there's actually billions of pounds needed to be spent on ensuring that homes across the country are safe.
No, the bill is huge. That's clear. I mean, Peter, just on the stay put policy, one of the most frightening things about the book was the advice that was being given to residents, which you reported on, about staying put, and how gradually you saw you in your mind you had the fire reaching them closer and closer, and they were, kept being told to stay put or to go higher. Do you think that policy has been dropped quietly now?
No, quite the opposite, unfortunately. I mean, I think well, I mean, there's the policy at a kind of government policy document level, and then there's the real world reality of what people would do if another fire like Grenfell happens. The obviously the Grenfell Tower inquiry, for any of your viewers or listeners who don't know, the Grenfell Tower inquiry's been split into two phases. The first phase, which concluded about 3 years ago now, looked at the events of the night of the fire in great detail, and it produced a report with recommendations. The fundamental philosophy of which was staying put is fine when it works, but you need to have a plan B for all buildings in case it doesn't. Not just buildings where we know that there's dangerous cladding, because as Paul was referring to in the other answer he gave, there are buildings out there with faults buried deep inside the three-dimensional structure of the building, which you simply won't know about until a fire exposes the fact that a piece of passive fire protection, which is crucial to that building's fire strategy, isn't there. And so you need to have a way for people to get out of buildings, clear way for people to get out of buildings, and a clear plan for the fire authorities about what to do when those fires that we don't expect, the ones that get out of control, the ones that go in an unexpected direction happen, because they will happen. Again, as Paul said, fires are just part of residential life. If you want people to cook and live and smoke and sleep and all the other things that, own electrical appliances, sooner or later some of those things are going to catch fire. What the government's approach has been is to sort of reject that, really, reject it at its kind of most fundamental root. And their view is that we should stick with stay put as a kind of all or nothing, complete reliance policy, unless we know about existing fire safety issues with the building, in which case we should have a simultaneous evacuation policy, which is like being in an office where everyone gets out every time someone burns a toast. And neither of those things are very good, frankly. It doesn't really work on either front, that as an evacuation strategy. You need to be cleverer than that, really, and you need to have plan B, which is everyone escaping themselves, and then plan C, which is people being rescued by the fire brigade. And I think there's a really key area where the government have not wanted to go down that road, and that's with regard to disabled residents. And I wrote in the book, and as I've written elsewhere, and many other people have too, Grenfell Tower fire disproportionately killed disabled people. There was 37 disabled residents in the tower at the time the blaze started. By the morning, 15 of them were dead. So it killed 41% of the tower's disabled population, which is a higher rate than any other group in the building. And if you add children onto that, getting on for half of the victims were either disabled or children, so they were vulnerable. What the Grenfell Tower inquiry report said was that you should develop emergency evacuation plans personalized for an individual. So if they have crutches, if they have autism, if they're deaf, then you should think in advance what is needed to get this person out of this building in an emergency. And that is something the government has refused to implement. There was actually a High Court case concluded last week, and we'll get the findings in the new year, where I think for the second time the government was being brought through the courts in order to try and persuade it to implement that policy. But at the moment it doesn't want to. And so we do remain. I mean, I think fire authorities are trying to think differently about how they'll approach it. I'm sure Bristol's fire service have asked themselves those questions, and housing providers have to some degree, about what's the best way of evacuating this building. And certainly residents, won't stay in a building that was burning like Grenfell anymore.
No.
But at a kind of government policy level, rather than a kind of quiet dropping of the stay put policy, it's been more of a kind of full-throated retention of the status quo.
Talking about, you talked earlier about civil servants, and I don't go into too much detail about this, but it was a comment from a civil servant, wasn't it, that gave you the title of your book, Show Me the Bodies?
Yeah, that's correct. Is a civil servant by the name of Brian Martin, who there's an architect called Sam Webb, and I appreciate you said not too much detail on this, but who very sadly passed away just a couple of months before the book was published. Who'd been a long-term campaigner on fire safety, and going back to this same period I talked about with Stephen Williams, the Lakanal House Coroner's Inquest has published its findings. It's asked for this review of regulations, but government is not doing it. And Brian Martin was the civil servant who held responsibility for that area of regulations. And he was asked by Sam Webb, according to Sam Webb's witness statement, why he hadn't implemented the Lakanal coroner's recommendations. And Sam Webb recalled that Brian's response was, where's the evidence? Show me the bodies. Now, Brian Martin denied saying that when he was asked about it at the inquiry. But there was another witness who said they'd heard him say it too, and it might be something the inquiry comes to a conclusion on. I don't know. Nonetheless, I think that that statement spoke to a philosophy, which was the government's philosophy, that there simply weren't enough fire deaths occurring in the UK to justify tougher restrictions on industry. And whether that quote was, whether we agree with Brian Martin or we agree with Sam Webb about whether or not that quote was said in the time and place it was said, that philosophy was absolutely there. And that philosophy was right at the heart of why the government didn't do anything to prevent the Grenfell Tower fire. And I think the thing is, you've got to think, what they really were saying there is that they didn't care enough. They didn't care enough about preventing a hypothetical tragedy. They were willing, and they accepted the fact that they would wait until a tragedy happened until they acted. Essentially, that might not be the exact thoughts that were going through their mind, but that was a consequence of their actions. And so I thought something about that quote, the idea that you kind of don't, if you don't have to do it, you won't do it. And if we'd rather care about something else, this just isn't a priority, cut across so much of that attitude was displayed across so many of the different organizations that found themselves in the spotlight during the inquiry, that it felt to me that it kind of captured something about what had happened and why, which is why I pulled it out for the title of the book.
And just staying on remarkable quotes that you report on in the book, let's talk about the corporate sector and their responsibility. You quote a manufacturer called Kingspan, someone from there, who, when asked about the fire risks of their insulation, said, "I think they are getting me confused with someone who gives a damn." And then also you quote from the same company, after a fire test was passed on the third attempt, said their response was "fucking happy days." I mean, these are remarkable comments. Yeah. These all came out in the inquiry.
Certainly did. I mean, some of them, yeah. That is a small snippet. I mean, I think Kingspan delivered quite a few quotes like that. There was a WhatsApp or text message exchange between two employees who were discussing their own fire testing of their product, who said noted that the product didn't actually pass if it was tested in full, and the other one said shit product, and then the last one said all we do is lie in here, which again Kingspan would disagree with this, because they say that was examples of sort of disappointing poor conduct among one team and among a small number of employees. They've argued that quite strongly, but it's up to the inquiry now to decide whether that actually said something about the culture of Kingspan, and not just Kingspan, but the other corporates involved in this who kind of, maybe not in quite such callous language, but certainly similar sorts of emails. What imagine the kind of culture, the working environment in which those comments can be made by quite senior people in a company. What does that say about their attitude to safety and their attitude to the end users of their product ultimately? And I mean, I think it's pretty scary, really. I mean, like I say, it's important. Kingspan's reputation is important to them, and I think some of those employees have been disciplined, and you know, they've instituted management reviews, and they say they're moving in a different direction now. Nonetheless, it's very much of interest to the inquiry, I think, to investigate that culture and how it came to exist.
And you can read full details of those comments in Peter's book, and also the statements of witnesses to the inquiry at grenfelltowerinquiry.org.uk. Paul, can I ask you about the "we" that's in Peter's subtitle, how we let Grenfell happen? I mean, we've had recent examples of, you know, we're reading more and more about damp in houses. We've had the terrible tragedy of the 2-year-old boy recently who died, and that was a result, supposedly, of some of the problems caused by that damp. And we've also left housing to become a major crisis in this country. How are we responsible to make housing better in the future?
Yeah, there are many different types of housing crisis. There's not a single housing crisis, and the trouble is we keep trying to deal with one and then we ignore the others. So, for instance, one of the problems, you know, the obvious housing crisis is the one where you see people sleeping on the streets and the rise in homelessness. We've certainly got a huge rise again in people in temporary accommodation. Certainly in Bristol, I think we'll get the homelessness street count stats out again soon, and I think they will show a rise as well. So there's that very obvious part of the housing crisis, which is around homelessness. But there are other issues as well. So, for instance, a lot of the housing stock that's held by social landlords is post World War II, often built incredibly cheaply. I mean, I looked at the estate I grew up on. The average cost of building a property was £1,480, which in today's money is 50,000. Now, you can imagine all the corners that would have to be cut to build a house for £50,000 now. And so you have got a huge number of properties which are way, way past their sell-by date, that need to be either massively improved and upgraded themselves, or demolished and something else built in their wake. And that part of the housing crisis has almost completely disappeared, or had almost completely disappeared from view. But what we've seen with, you know, the recent cases, the sort of campaigning of Quajo around housing standards and ITV as well, is that there are lots of people who are living in social housing, where all the people in social housing like to think they're lovely people doing wonderful things for society, but are not addressing the quality of the housing because they feel, I guess, that they've been directed to build. What they've got to do is build to deal with that other housing crisis. And also all of the attention has been placed under the regulatory system, not on the quality of homes, but on the quality of accounts. And therefore, some organisations have definitely took the eye off the ball in terms of their existing homes, or have been left in a position where there's funding to build new housing, there's not funding to regenerate existing housing, and have, not unsurprisingly, followed the money. And so we have got a crisis of housing condition in the social housing sector, as well as a crisis of housing provision and housing numbers. And we can't keep swapping which one we think's important. So, and under the Blair government, there was much more focus on housing condition, but not much on housing provision. So we have got a real problem, and housing associations, we all have to look at our position in this crisis. I mean, we're not completely guilt-free. As in Grenfell, it's possible for everybody to blame everybody else. But the important thing is actually that you take responsibility for your own actions. So there are issues. Grenfell sort of refocused the government on tenants' rights, tenants' voice, housing condition, although the legislation is only starting to go through Parliament now. It seems to have taken an awful long time to get that into place. And there will be a new system of regulation, which is the old system of regulation coming back again in many respects.
And just staying with you, Paul, just turning to Bristol, because you're no longer a member of the cabinet, but you were a member of the cabinet in Grenfell when Grenfell happened. Have I got that correct? And then
yes,
for 4 years after that, I think. And you're also now responsible for around 800 homes in your work. And we've seen campaigns, we've seen actual activity to reduce fire risks in some properties in Bristol. You've got the use of waking watch wardens and the programme of sprinkler installation. How much progress do you think has been made in stopping another Grenfell happening, or simply making properties a bit safer for people?
Well, in terms of generally across the country, nowhere near enough. I mean, there's still lots of cladding that needs to be removed and replaced. And what we found at Elim is you take the cladding off, then you find the fire breaks that aren't there, that are supposed to be there, and then that takes you through to the insulation that you've got in the building. And then you think, oh well, what do we do about this? And so every time you look, you find something else, and the deeper that you go, the more that you find. And there's, I think Pete said at the beginning of his talk, that there are hundreds of thousands of people trapped in properties that they can't sell. They might not feel safe living in them, but there's nowhere else for them to go until this problem is sorted out. In terms of building safety, obviously there's a lot of focus on building safety, and everybody's doing more work, I think, than ever before in terms of checking fire safety, working with fire services around their fire risk assessments, and hopefully informing and involving their residents as well. In Bristol, as you know, there've been some fires recently. I think one of them was another danger that I think Pete has identified and written about in Inside Housing, which is rechargeable lithium batteries. There have been fires caused by those electric wheelchairs that are rechargeable. The one in Bristol, which caused a very tragic death when somebody tried to escape their flat through the window, was a rechargeable scooter. And there's, it seems as soon as you deal with one fire risk, another one crops up, and there's a lot of work to do. Fundamentally, I think we should move to a situation where every property has sprinklers fitted. That will certainly give people much more safety and security. And they don't. I mean, Pete joked about burning the toast and the whole building gets evacuated because the sprinklers have gone off. Obviously, they're much more sophisticated now in terms of the way that they work, and burning toast won't set your sprinkler off. But there's still a lot of people who think that will happen, and that every time they light a match to have a fag, then they're going to be drowned in water. So there's a bit of an education required there. In Wales now, I believe every new property has to have a sprinkler fitted. In Britain, I think it's only for properties over 49 feet or so many meters or whatever, but we really need to up that. And I'm really pleased that the council sort of reinvigorated the sprinkler programme that I started after the Grenfell fire, because we do have to plan for the basis that buildings will catch fire, because they will.
There was a case, there wasn't a very recent.
Sorry, Paul, I don't think I said that sprinklers would go off when someone burns their toast. I think I said that when there's a simultaneous evacuation policy in place in the building, everyone needs to leave even during a minor fire. But I am aware that sprinklers are heat activated and very efficient at not activating for minor incidents like that. So yeah, I'm all for sprinklers. Just to get that on the record.
Just one quick thing.
I didn't think you wouldn't be. I think it was a throwaway comment you made about office fires. But yeah, we've got to make properties. People have got to be safe and comfortable in their homes as a bottom line.
And Paul, just a quick question. There was a recent fire at Eccleston House in Bristol, and was that put down to the use of expanded polystyrene cladding, which was flammable?
Yeah, from what I understand is that polystyrene cladding, which there's a lot of in Bristol and a lot of across the country, I'm sure, if it's properly rendered and flush to the building, then it is fire resistant. But if it's broken and cracked and the render becomes cracked, it can then become a fire risk. And certainly in that case in Bristol, the fire did spread through that type of cladding. And that type of cladding will now have to be added to the list. There have also been some fires, I think there were a couple in London fairly recently, where timber cladding was sort of partly responsible for the spread of the fire. And so some cladding was brought in for aesthetics. A lot of it was brought in to improve the thermal efficiency of buildings. But there's a sort of a question mark against a huge amount of it. I think, from our perspective now, we would only, as a housing association, we would probably only look at rock wall type cladding, which is, hopefully you can't burn it unless you're trying incredibly hard, because it's sort of effectively made of concrete. But I'm sure it's climate change, its carbon footprint's not great, but you have to compromise between these different drivers.
Just moving on to what we do about this, there was a report in early December from the National Housing Federation and the Chartered Institute of Better Social Housing into social housing provision, and that obviously looked at the state of social housing. That was quite a difficult report. You've got house builders committed to investing, I think, £1.5 billion in improving properties, but that money is still a drop in the ocean in a way, isn't it, Peter? It's a huge bill that's got to be paid here. What would you like to see government do, ideally, and some of the people involved, like the fire brigade service as well? So
I mean, there are only difficult answers to what to do. I mean, like the building safety crisis, which we've seen since Grenfell which has emerged since Grenfell, is the consequence of 30 years of neglect, 30 years of poor building regulations, and lots of buildings have been built in that time. Lots of them have been maintained poorly in that time as well. I think that what the crisis has really missed since the start is a sense of kind of central national leadership. And I think that, that's ironically enough kind of part of what took us here as well, that sort of absence of that. The government's been quite willing to sort of publish advice notes saying, if you have combustible materials on the outside of your building, you should seek further advice. And that's not really good enough, frankly. I think that what that's done is kind of pass the decision down to somebody with a vested interest. So either the building owner, who doesn't necessarily want to do work to their property, or the insurance provider or the mortgage provider, who very much does, but won't pay for it. And so you end up with kind of like very, very risk averse approaches where they're driven by mortgage providers, very risk happy approaches when they're driven by building owners who would really rather this problem went away and they didn't have to worry about it anymore. And what you just need is the same thing that we've needed since the day after the Grenfell Tower fire, frankly, and that is clear, unambiguous guidance so that we can determine some buildings are safe, some buildings are kind of in the middle and they need sprinklers and they need fire alarms, but we don't need to kind of rip them down and start again. And some buildings are really dangerous, and those ones, you know, we're a society which taxes people in order to provide public services which benefit us all, and I can't see how preventing another huge tower block fire doesn't benefit us all, so that those ones need to benefit from public funding. If you can't get the people responsible for it to pay, which is obviously where the first port of call should be. Now, some of that has happened. There's been some public funding come in. There's been some, you know, and increasingly robust efforts to get that money out of the responsible parties. But we still lack that clarity in this crisis of defining the wood from the trees, really, and the really dangerous buildings from the moderately dangerous buildings, from the relatively safe buildings. And until we get that willingness from government to take the lead in doing that, I think the crisis is only ever going to be solved at the fringes. It's never really going to feel like we're moving towards a proper solution.
And Paul, you're responsible for, what is it, 800 houses. You've had your funding cut. Housing associations have over the years. I mean, what are the solutions for you, not just in making sure that your existing buildings are safe, but making sure you can create the new buildings that people need and feel safe and comfortable in?
I think there's some really tedious things, like making sure your asset management team and your development team are working together, and that fire safety is really top of their agenda. I've certainly said to my team as well, is that anything that we build should have anything. Obviously, it's not so easy for things that we buy, but things that we build should have sprinklers in as of course. There is, of course, I mean, there's another thing underlying this, is that there's this huge skills shortage. I mean, the reason we've got some of these problems is because a lot of the work's been really badly done, because people haven't necessarily been properly trained, or they're not properly supervised. We also, you know, all organisations are surveying all of their properties to see what needs to be done to them or with them. So, I mean, a lot of those things are in place. I think what Pete says is that, you know, is absolutely at the core of it, is that government needs to hold the ring. Doesn't need to do it all, but it needs to be there, showing that it's responsible. I think there have been some improvements in government's approach under Michael Gove, and that, you know, that I think he has been trying to find a solution to the problem within the terms of the, you know, the overall government that he's in. There's a limit to what he can achieve, but there have been some positive moves. But, you know, I've as I say, I've got a building where I've got to deal with this issue. It's not quite tall enough to fit some criteria. It's not quite dangerous enough to fit some other criteria. And so, you know, potentially we could end up in court with the developer of the building, and that you're talking about, you know, probably over £1 million to get into court to get all of the evidence that's required. So what we've got is a really expensive process in terms of getting any solution. We need to look at how those can be streamlined, but ultimately it needs money. I mean, Pete's absolutely right. You know, some properties are safe, but people might be worried about them because they haven't had all of the guarantees that they require. Some buildings might need some work, and there's an issue about where that's funded. And then there are other properties, quite frankly, they do need to be put to the bulldozer, and we need to replace it. And at the moment, there's no funding for regeneration of existing properties and that funding to replace them. And so, you know, as with a lot of these things, it will come back to a combination of legislation, regulation, and finance.
I was reflecting as I was preparing for this event, an event that we did with Robert Peston, and that was about 5 months after the Grenfell fire. It was about his book called WTF, What Have We Done? Why did it happen? How do we take back control? And his conclusion to that book was that Grenfell changes everything. But did it? A final question to you both. Paul?
No, I mean, the death of Awab the other, couple of years ago, and people are talking about a defining moment. It's like, how many defining moments do we need before we grasp the nettle? And of course, these things, they disappear from people's minds and consciousness. And so, it's important that Pete's books come in now to sort of reinvigorate that debate and to remind people of something that only happened, a few years ago. But we've moved on. We have quite a short attention span, and we move on from one thing to the other. And of course, people now are very concerned about cost of living and heating and the war in Ukraine and all the rest of it. And there's a danger that the public's and government's attention span is very short, and so things that should change just don't change. And so I don't feel that fundamentally we live now in a better funded, better regulated environment, generally, not just around housing, but in the country as a whole.
Peter?
I think we all felt a bit like Robert Peston at the time that it would. But honestly, if you could have said to me 5 years ago that we'd be here now, so many buildings unsafe, still really not resolving this issue around the stay put policy, still no funding for the retrofitting of sprinklers into social housing, still building buildings with only one staircase, still with no movement yet on the promised tougher regulation of social housing providers and empowerment of residents, all of that stuff. Where is the change? I mean, it's where anyone I would ask who thinks that they would answer that question differently, what are they talking about? Because I can't see really substantive changes. I think what I would say, just to not end on too sour a note, is that sometimes it is harder to see. It's easier to see the change that hasn't happened than the change that has happened. And I think that there probably are grassroots level. I think that there are probably organizations that have taken this stuff seriously. I think that there probably are people who will work in a different way now to how they did before, because some of these lessons have hit home. And those kind of smaller things do add up to something bigger once they're all put together. But if we're talking about, has this changed things? Are we a different country now than the one we were before Grenfell, which I guess is what Robert Peston meant? Then the answer just has to be no. We're the same country, and we could see another Grenfell happen. And I think in some ways it's one of the most depressing things about this whole thing for me, really, is the whole show me the bodies thing suggests that we wait for a disaster until things change. And actually that's too optimistic, because we wait for a disaster and then still don't change. So yeah, sorry to leave you on a real downer, but that's unfortunately the position we're in.
Thank you, Peter, for the book, and thank you to Inside Housing for giving you the time and the space to follow this story from the start. Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen is published by One World. It's a brilliant book and should be read widely. We can all learn from this and hope that it will lead to justice for the victims. Thank you, Paul and Peter, for joining us today.